Now.org, the War and Peace Report. Well, protesters in more than 40 U.S. cities also gathered Saturday to oppose tax cuts for the wealthy amidst budget cuts to public services. There's a demonstration in Washington, D.C., which targeted Bank of America, which protesters say has not paid federal income taxes for the past 2 years. Many of the protests were organized by activists with U.S. Uncut, a sister organization to U.K. Uncut, which helped organize Saturday's protest in London. To discuss all of these protests, we're joined by the British journalist Johann Hari, columnist for The Independent in London, and here in New York, Allison Kilkenny, co-host of the political radio show Citizen Radio. She's a freelance journalist who's blogging at The Nation magazine about the U.S. Uncut movement. Let's go first to Johann in Britain. Talk about the significance of this. I mean, we're talking 500,000 people in the streets this weekend.
This was the second biggest protest in the entire history of London. That's the City of London. You know, it's really important to think about how big that is. And also it's worth bearing in mind, these cuts haven't actually started yet. They start in the next few weeks. So these are people, 500,000 people on the streets before this program has really begun. That's a pretty extraordinary thing. But to understand why, I think you have to see the context. The last time British public spending was cut on this degree wasn't before I was born, wasn't before my mother was born. It's before my grandmother was born. It's in the early 1920s. This is an absolutely massive assault that's being led on the nature of the British state. And the consequences are being felt by everyone, particularly the middle class and the poor. Well, particularly the poor, but also the middle class. You know, just to give you a couple of examples, huge cut to housing subsidies here means that even the Conservative Mayor of London says that 200,000 poor people are going to be forced out of their homes and forced out of London in a process that he called social cleansing. This is a really dramatic change. You know, the biggest cuts are going to disabled people, homeless people. There's a massive close down of homeless shelters all across the country. You know, the people who caused this crisis are richer than they've ever been, and the people who had nothing to do with the crisis are being terribly punished.
Can you talk about the policy of targeting corporations, naming and targeting corporations, Johann?
What's happening at the moment is a huge transfer of wealth. In addition to this huge austerity program, what we're seeing is a huge transfer of wealth. Taxes are going up on the middle class and the poor, services are being cut for them, while there are being big tax cuts for people at the top. This has been going on for a long time. It went on under the last government to some degree, the Labour government as well, but not to anything like the same degree. And just to give you one example, the 6th richest man in Britain is a person called Philip Green. In 2009, he earned £1.6 billion and paid nothing in tax. That's nothing. You know, the average person on the street paid more tax than him. Give you another example. Vodafone, one of the biggest cell phone companies in the world and huge here in Britain, had been refusing to pay a large part of its tax bill for absolutely years. It bought a German company. It was claiming that the deal ran through a post office box in Luxembourg, even though they've got no business in Luxembourg. The whole thing was a nonsense. They built up a huge tax bill that the Labour government was fighting for, £6 billion, enough to cover the cost of all the housing subsidies for all those poor people who are going to be forced out of their homes. When the Conservatives came to power, they more or less cancelled that tax bill. They cancelled almost all of it. It's a very powerful symbol of their priorities. You know, hand out a huge amount of money to the rich, take it away from the poor. Now, what happened is a group of ordinary citizens, you know, nurses and firefighters and doctors, were outraged by this and said, you know what, we don't have to take this. Why don't we just next Saturday, this started last autumn, why don't we just next Saturday go and physically sit down in front of the biggest Vodafone store in London and say, you know what, you want to operate on our streets, you pay our taxes. And the story of what happened next is incredible. A few days later, completely unrelated group in a completely different part of Britain went and sat down in front of their Vodafone shops. And then it started happening all over Britain. And 2 weeks later, 50 cities across Britain had blockaded their Vodafone stores, saying, you can't do this to us. And it was really moving and powerful to see the people who turned up. There were people who were worried about losing their homes. There were people who were worried about losing their public services. And there are people who think that the crisis should be paid for by the people who caused it. It's a movement called UK Uncut, and it's really grown.
Allison Kilkenny, you've been covering UK Uncut and US Uncut, and the same tactics are being used, like targeting Bank of America.
Yeah, well, there's actually an interesting connection between the two groups. In US Uncut, they've been targeting Verizon, which is a huge corporate tax dodger. And Verizon's able to get away with not paying its taxes by redirecting their profits to their foreign wireless partner, which is Vodafone. So the two groups are trying to organize coordinated international efforts right now where U.S. Uncut would protest Verizon while simultaneously UK Uncut would protest Vodafone.
Talk about the overall strategy and the other corporations that are being targeted in the United States.
Well, the strategy is similar to what UK Uncut is doing, where they go to these stores, sometimes they occupy it. Just recently, U.S. Uncut in D.C. was successfully able to shut down a Bank of America. In fact, the bank managers just saw them coming and allegedly pulled the fire alarm before they even had to deal with anybody.
And why Bank of America?
Bank of America is a huge corporate tax dodger. You know, interestingly enough, they received $45 billion in taxpayer dollars during the bailout, yet they haven't paid a cent in federal income taxes in the past 2 years. Now, if you or I did that, we would go to jail. But because Bank of America is a huge corporation, they get to play by a different set of rules. And it's not just Bank of America, actually. 2/3 of corporations within the United States don't pay a nickel in federal income taxes.
Well, take the example of General Electric.
Yes.
Jeffrey Immelt, who is the head of General Electric, is President Obama's job czar. This is not a past job, it's a current job,
yes.
Both of them. Talk about General Electric. It, too, has been targeted.
Yes, and they had lavish profits. And what's interesting about that is candidate Obama talked a lot about these corporate tax havens. There was a lot of tough talk on the campaign trail. And actually, when he was a senator, he signed a piece of legislation to shut down them. And, you know, he had a great line during the campaign where he talked about there was one building in the Cayman Islands that was home to 75,000 corporations. And isn't that ridiculous? And isn't that corrupt? Yet, since that tough talk and since he's become president, there hasn't been a lot of follow-up. And the whole tax haven scheme costs the United States $100 billion every year. Imagine what we could do with $100 billion, how many police, firefighters, teachers' jobs we could save with that money. You know, in all of these states, we hear that we have to suffer under these austerity measures because there just isn't enough revenue. But there isn't a revenue problem, according to U.S. Uncut. These corporations are just stealing from the country.
I mean, GE not only didn't pay taxes in the last 2 years, they claimed a tax benefit
yes.
of $3.2 billion last year.
And there's something like 115 corporations on the S&P that also enjoy that arrangement. They receive more in tax credits than they pay into the country.
And so what about the comparison of how U.S. Uncut is organizing with UK Uncut? UK Uncut, 500,000 people. You heard Johann say the second largest protest in London in history.
Yeah, well, it's definitely a newer, smaller movement. In fact, it was partly inspired by an article Johann wrote for The Nation. A young man named Carl Gibson founded the very first U.S. Uncut chapter in Jackson, Mississippi. But they are definitely a grassroots movement. They're small. Cells go out to various stores like Verizon, FedEx, Bank of America, all the big tax dodgers. And right now they're just protesting. Sometimes they actually occupy the stores, but it's definitely a really exciting, growing movement. I know every time I check in with them, it seems like they've increased by another tenfold.
Johann Hari, the response of the British government right now, what kind of effect do you think this massive demonstration will have in Britain?
Oh, Amy, sorry, just to correct something. The main protest was not organised by UK Uncut. It was organised by the TEC, the main body of trade unions across Britain. I wouldn't want to give the impression that all of this was UK Uncut. In terms of the reaction, you know, we've got a very right-wing government, but we do know already, I mean, UK Uncut has been effective in the sense that they are already, the government feels they need to talk about tax avoidance. They claim they're acting on it. Already several, you know, large parts of the main equivalent to the IRS have been moved to work on checking the taxes of big businesses rather than small businesses. But, you know, it's a very right-wing government, and a huge amount of pressure has to be put on them before they're going to change. But, you know, just to talk to something that Allison was saying as well about GE, these big companies, they justify this behaviour by saying, oh, we do it all ourselves, we produce all this profit ourselves. And I'd just like to say, let's just do a thought experiment. You know, for 1 month, I'd like to do an experiment. Say Philip Green, the guy, hugely wealthy guy who refuses to pay taxes in Britain. Let's take one of his stores for 1 month and take away all the services he refuses to pay for. So we won't collect the garbage out the back. When the rats come, we won't send pest control. If there's a shoplifter, we won't send the police. If there's a fire, we won't send the fire brigade. If the staff get sick, they can't get treated in public hospitals. And let him come back at the end of that month and say he did it all himself. He doesn't do it all himself. These people make money using the infrastructure that all of us pay for. Now, there's a term for that in medical literature. It's called parasitism. If you are feeding on a body but contributing nothing to it, you've turned yourself into a parasite. And we don't have to put up with this. UK Uncut has really shown a small, determined band of citizens coming together can change a debate in this way. It is not true that there's no alternative. Almost the worst cuts in Britain, all of them could be paid for just by making a very small number of wealthy people, not even increasing the taxes on them, although I'm in favour of that, just making them pay the amount of tax that they are legally due.
Finally, Allison Kilkenny, as you cover the U.S. Uncut movement, where does it span in terms of the political spectrum?
It's right and left. In fact, this is probably the least controversial story I've ever covered. I've had very positive feedback from Republicans, from Tea Party members, because, they really see it as a form of theft. We always hear about the free market, but if the market was actually free, Bank of America would have failed because they made really bad, shady mortgage deals. But instead, they got $45 billion in taxpayer money. So that's done. But now that they've been bailed out, it's time to contribute back to the society that facilitated their lavish wealth. And they're just not willing to do that. It's a form of economic treason. And, Republicans, Democrats, independents, thus far, in my opinion, all see it that way.
I want to thank you both for being with us. Allison Kilkenny, co-host of the political radio show Citizen Radio, blogging at The Nation, covering the U.S. Uncut movement. And Johann Hari, joining us from Britain, writes for The Independent in London, has been covering the UK Uncut movement, and will continue to cover both. This is Democracy